Shallan sat on a rocky outcrop, her sketch pad balanced against her knees, as she carefully outlined the intricate petals of a violet-flowered rockbud. The bloom was half open, curling outward, as if hesitant to reveal its full beauty to the sun. The chol beside her shifted, its enormous carapace scraping against stone as it searched for more scrub grass to graze on. She tapped her charcoal stick against the page, smudging a bit of shading along the thick vines that twisted out from the bud's base. It was so easy to lose herself in this, to forget about wars, about responsibilities, about the tangled mess of who she was supposed to be. Out here, alone with her drawings and the life of Roshar, the world was simple. Simple? Vale's voice scoffed in her mind. You call this simple? You're in the shattered plains, still reeling from a battle that nearly killed you. And let's not forget you're supposed to be a radiant scholar, a wife, a spy, and whatever else Jasnah expects you to be. Don't listen to her, Radiance said, her tone calm but firm. You're doing what you love. Jasnah would approve. She always said that understanding the world was as important as changing it. Shallan sighed and ignored them both. She turned to a fresh page, rubbing a bit of charcoal dust between her fingers, before beginning a new sketch. This time, she chose the Skyil, a thin, sinuous creature that glided through the air in the distance. She caught its elongated body in a single fluid stroke, its membranous fins extended, tail curling like a ribbon. She remembered the first time she had seen one up close, how she had giggled in delight as the eel had darted around her head, its sleek body shimmering in the light. That had been a lifetime ago, back when she was just a curious girl with an interest in botany, before war and radiancy and the tangled mess of her mind had complicated everything. Before Adolin. A warmth spread through her chest at the thought of him. She had expected marriage to be another role she had to play, another mask to wear, but Adolin had been different, kind, honest, so painfully earnest that she sometimes felt guilty for holding parts of herself back from him. He loves all of us, Radiant reminded her gently, even if he doesn't always understand. Well, he certainly doesn't understand spycraft, Vale said. I swear, the man wouldn't know subtlety if it slapped him with a shard blade. Shallan chuckled, then blinked in surprise. When had she last laughed? Truly laughed. She turned the page again, sketching the coastline in the distance. The distant waves crashed against jagged rocks, white spray rising high into the air. She thought of Jasnah, standing tall against the storm, always sure, always confident. Shallan had spent so long trying to impress her, to prove she belonged at her side. Yet Jasnah had already known, hadn't she? A scholar does not simply memorize. She seeks, she questions. She studies because knowledge is the strongest weapon one can wield. Shallan exhaled, placing her charcoal down. Is it? She whispered. Is knowledge truly stronger than steel? For now, all she had was her sketchbook and her thoughts, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Shallan flipped to a fresh page, brushing stray charcoal dust from her fingertips. The distant sky, painted in deep blues and scattered with wisps of violet stormlight, stretched endlessly before her. She traced the contours of the horizon with her eyes, then tried to capture them in careful strokes, though no amount of shading or precision could fully replicate the way the light shifted in the vastness of Roshar's sky. She frowned. No, it wasn't right. The lines were too harsh, the shadows too stark. She reached for an eraser, but her hand hesitated. Perfection is an illusion, Radiant murmured in her mind. You must accept the flaws in your work, as you must accept the flaws in yourself. Shallan sighed, rolling her eyes. Thank you, Radiant. I'll be sure to meditate on that while I fix this storming mess. Vale chuckled. That's the spirit. Ignore the poetic nonsense and just make it work. She smirked and let her fingers smudge the excess charcoal, softening the edges. Yasna would call this a failure of precision, wouldn't she? Be deliberate in all things, Shallan. Thought precedes action. Control precedes mastery. Yasna's voice had always held such certainty. There had been times Shallan had resented it. Times she had longed to shake her mentor and demand, "How do you know? How can you be so sure of everything?" Now she understood. Yasna had chosen certainty because doubt was a weakness she could not afford. A gust of wind stirred Shallan's hair, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. The shattered plains stretched far beyond where she sat, broken plateaus rising and falling like frozen waves of rock. They had been a battlefield once, her battlefield. She had fought here. She had survived. And yet, she still felt like an imposter in her own skin. She turned her gaze downward and resumed sketching. A tiny cremling scuttled along the stone near her feet, its delicate legs clicking as it moved. She caught the segmented shape in a few quick strokes, detailing its translucent shell and twitching antennae. It was incredible how creatures on Roshar adapted to such an unforgiving world. Like you, Radiant mused, you've adapted too. Had she? Sometimes it felt like she was just faking it, pretending to be brave, pretending to be capable, pretending to be the woman everyone expected her to be. Yasna's brilliant protégée, Adolin's loving wife, a leader among the Radiants. Vale snorted. You're not faking it. You're just refusing to admit you're actually good at this. Shallan shook her head and returned her attention to the drawing. She darkened the shading on the cremling's shell, adding depth. It was a tiny thing, fragile and insignificant. And yet, it had survived out here, among the shifting landscapes and deadly predators. If something so small could endure, then surely she could too. A distant laugh echoed through the air. Shallan glanced up, her heart lifting slightly. It was Adolin. He was back. She gathered her supplies and stood, dusting off her sketchbook. As she turned toward the camp, she let herself smile. Maybe she was still figuring things out. Maybe she wasn't certain about everything. But for now, she would walk forward, one step, one sketch, one memory at a time. Shallan walked slowly back toward the camp, her fingers still smudged with charcoal, her sketchbook tucked securely under one arm. The sound of Adolin's laughter drifted toward her again, warm and familiar, cutting through the cool evening air. She found herself smiling before she could stop it. The high storm had passed just a day ago, and the scent of damp stone lingered in the air. Small pools of water gathered in the crevices of the plateaus, reflecting the deep violet of the sky. Life, as always, had returned in full force. Cremlings skittered over rocks, lurgs croaked in the distance, and faintly glowing vines unfurled, soaking in the after-effects of the storm. Shallan reached the edge of the camp and spotted Adolin near a cluster of soldiers, laughing as he gestured wildly with his hands. He was telling a story, no doubt some exaggerated retelling of a duel or a ridiculous mishap with his rishadium, Sureblood. His golden hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and he looked so alive. She stopped for a moment, watching him. "You love him," Radiant said softly. Vale clicked her tongue. Of course she does. What kind of ridiculous observation is that? It's not ridiculous, Radiant replied. She still doubts herself. She still wonders if she deserves this happiness. Shallan clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to do this now. Not here. Not when Adolin was right in front of her, waiting. She squared her shoulders and strode forward. He turned as she approached, his grin widening. There you are. I was beginning to think I'd have to go hunting for you. You? Hunting for me? Shallan smirked. Isn't that a bit backward? Adolin chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, it wouldn't be the first time. He glanced down at her sketchbook. Anything interesting today? Shallan hesitated, then flipped it open, showing him the sky eel she had drawn earlier. He studied it with the same intensity he gave to his shardblade practice, as if committing every line to memory. I like this one, he said. It looks free. Shallan exhaled softly. Free. Was that what she was trying to capture? She hadn't thought about it at the time, but now, looking at the sketch through Adolin's eyes, she saw it. She nodded and closed the book. You're just saying that because you don't want to admit I'm better with charcoal than you are with a sword. Adolin gasped in mock offense. Blasphemy! I demand satisfaction. A duel at dawn. Shallan grinned. Oh? And what weapon shall I use? A particularly sharp quill. Absolutely devastating, he said, placing a hand over his heart. I surrender. She laughed, and for a moment, the weight in her chest lightened. Maybe she didn't have to figure out everything all at once. Maybe, for now, it was enough to stand here, in this moment, with the man who made her feel like she wasn't broken at all. In the back of her mind, Yasna's voice whispered, Happiness is not the absence of struggle. It is the choice to find joy despite it. Shallan glanced at Adolin, still grinning, and thought that maybe, just maybe, she was learning how to do that. Later that evening, Shallan sat by the fire, flipping through her sketchbook. The pages were filled with a collection of Roshar's life, rock buds in various stages of bloom, the sleek glide of a sky eel, the intricate patterns of a kremling's shell. Each sketch was a memory, a moment frozen in time, and yet, as she stared at them, she felt an odd sort of detachment. Adolin was nearby, polishing his shard blade, his expression one of relaxed concentration. The quiet hum of the camp surrounded them, soldiers talking in low voices, the occasional clatter of weapons being cleaned, the rustling of tarps in the wind. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. You're thinking too much, Vale said, which means you're about to ruin a perfectly good evening. She's reflecting, Radiant corrected. That's not the same as ruining something. Shallan let out a slow breath. They were both right, in a way. She ran her fingers over a page filled with sketches of Urithiru, towers stretching toward the sky, halls filled with light, Yasna standing at the edge of a balcony, her silhouette outlined against the storms. It seemed so distant now, like something from another life. She thought of Yasna's lessons, of the quiet moments spent in study, of the countless times she'd been pushed to think beyond what she knew. The world is not static, Shallan. It shifts. It evolves. To understand it, you must allow yourself to change with it. Had she changed? Or was she just pretending again, shifting between masks until even she wasn't sure which one was real? She glanced up at Adolin. He wasn't wearing a mask. He never did. What she saw was what he was, open, steady, real. She envied that about him. You're staring, he said without looking up. Shallan blinked. Am I? How embarrassing. Adolin smirked, still focused on his blade. You could at least pretend it's my incredible dueling skills you're admiring. Ah, but then I'd be lying, and Yasna says that's beneath me. He chuckled, setting the blade aside. Seriously, though, what's on your mind? Shallan hesitated. She wanted to say everything. Instead, she said, Do you ever feel like you're pretending? Adolin frowned slightly. Pretending. Like playing a role, being what people expect you to be. He considered for a moment, then nodded. Sure. I mean, I was practically born with a script in my hands. Dalinar Colin's son, heir to House Colin, shardbearer, duelist. People expect me to be those things, so I try to be them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But that doesn't mean I'm not me. I'm all those things. But I'm also the guy who trips over his own feet sometimes. The guy who names his boots. The guy who... Wait, Shallan interrupted. You name your boots? Adolin grinned. Of course. How else am I supposed to keep track of which ones are lucky? She burst into laughter, the weight in her chest easing just a little. That, she said, shaking her head, is either the most ridiculous or the most endearing thing I've ever heard. Why choose? He said, winking. She smiled and looked down at her sketchbook again. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe she never would. But right now, in this moment, she was here. And that was enough. Much later, when most of the camp had gone quiet, Shallan sat outside her tent, staring up at the stars. The faint glow of spheres illuminated the ground beside her, their soft light casting shifting shadows over her sketchbook. She should sleep. She knew. But the weight of her own thoughts kept her awake. You should be resting, Radiant murmured. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. And its own expectations, Vale added. People waiting for us to be something. Scholar, Radiant, wife. Spy Shallan ran her fingers over the cover of her sketchbook. And what if I just want to be me? She whispered. Neither of them answered. A soft rustling drew her attention, and she looked up to see Adolin approaching, his silhouette outlined against the dim firelight. He wasn't in his armor, wasn't carrying a blade, just Adolin, in a loose tunic, his hair slightly tousled from the wind. He sat down beside her without a word. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the quiet night, the distant sound of chulls shifting in their pens, the occasional crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind through the rock formations. Eventually, Adolin leaned back on his elbows and sighed. You ever wonder, he said, how different things might have been if none of this had happened? If there were no wars, no radiance, no destinies to fulfill? Shallan tilted her head. You mean, if you were just a spoiled prince, and I was just a girl who liked to draw? He chuckled. Something like that. She considered. It was a tempting thought. A quiet life, free of responsibilities. No battles, no shardblades, no desperate struggles to prove herself. Just ink and paper, warm afternoons spent sketching, the simple joys of existing without expectation. And yet, I don't think I'd trade it, she admitted. Even the worst parts, because then I wouldn't have met you. I wouldn't have learned the things Yasna taught me. I wouldn't have grown. Adolin smiled, tilting his head to look at her. I think you give yourself too little credit. You were always going to grow, Shallan. You're like, I don't know, one of these vines that find a way to climb no matter how many times the storm tries to tear them down. She looked at him, surprised. Vale whistled. Storms. He's good. Yes, Radiant agreed. And he's right. Shallan exhaled, shaking her head. "You say things like that so easily." Adolin grinned. "It's one of my many talents, right up there with lucky boots and tripping at exactly the wrong moment." She laughed softly, then leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think I'm glad things turned out this way," she murmured. He was quiet for a moment before whispering, "Me too." And for the first time in a long while, Shallan felt like she didn't need to pretend at all. The next morning, Shallan awoke to the golden light of dawn spilling across the camp. She stretched, blinking against the brightness, then rubbed at her face. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, pages fluttering in the breeze, filled with drawings she barely remembered making. Sleep had eventually claimed her, but not before her hands had found charcoal and captured the shapes of her thoughts. She sat up, tracing the lines absent-mindedly. A sky eel in mid-flight, Adolin laughing, Yasna standing tall and composed, and oddly herself, fragmented, 3 versions of Shallan staring back from the page, one smiling, one masked, one uncertain. "That's new," Vale remarked. "Or maybe it's something we've always known," Radiant added. Shallan closed the sketchbook with a sigh and stood, brushing dirt from her coat. The camp was already stirring, soldiers preparing for the day's march, voices rising in quiet conversation. Adolin was among them, of course, fastening the straps on his armor, his golden hair catching the morning light. He moved with an easy confidence, laughing at something Renarin had said. For a moment, Shallan simply watched him, as she had the night before. "You're staring again," Vale teased. Shallan rolled her eyes and made her way toward the others. "Good morning," she said as she approached. Adolin turned to her with a bright grin. "Good morning. You actually slept." "Something like that," she said, tapping her sketchbook. Adolin peered at it with curiosity. "Anything good in there?" Shallan hesitated, then opened it to a fresh page, flipping past the drawing of herself. "We'll see," she said. "I was thinking of sketching some of the flora today. The plants here have adapted so strangely to the high storms." Renarin, adjusting his spectacles, nodded. "It's fascinating, isn't it? Even in a world as harsh as Roshar, life finds a way to persist." Adolin gave him a sidelong glance. That sounded suspiciously like something Yasna would say. Shallan smirked. Oh, Yasna would be much more thorough. She'd probably have 3 books on the subject, and a full lecture prepared before breakfast. Adolin shuddered playfully. "Storms. She's terrifying." Shallan elbowed him lightly. "Only to those who underestimate her." She flipped to a blank page and took out her charcoal. "Come on. Let's go find something interesting before we have to march again. I need to capture the way the rock buds open here. It's different from the ones in Alethkar." Adolin smiled, grabbing his coat. "If it means I get to watch you work, I'm in." Renarin adjusted his glasses again. "I'd like to come too." And so, they set out together, stepping away from the camp, into the wilds of Roshar. Shallan crouched near a patch of rock buds, watching intently as their petals slowly peeled open in response to the gentle morning light. Tiny vines within the buds twitched, sensing the air, before extending cautiously, seeking moisture. She sketched quickly, capturing each delicate movement, each strange adaptation that allowed these plants to survive in such an unforgiving world. Adolin knelt beside her, peering at the rock buds with an expression of exaggerated concentration. "So, do they always do this? Or are they just showing off because they know you're watching?" Shallan smirked, glancing at him. Oh, absolutely. They've been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Renarin, who stood a few feet away examining a cluster of vines growing between the rocks, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. It's more likely they're reacting to the increased humidity from last night's storm. Their growth cycles are directly linked to high storm patterns. Adolin sighed dramatically. And here, I was hoping for sentient, attention-seeking rock buds. Shallan grinned, returning to her sketching. Well, if they were sentient, I imagine they'd be far too sophisticated to seek your approval. Probably Yasna's, though. Adolin groaned. You're never going to let me forget that I called her terrifying, are you? Vale chuckled in Shallan's mind. As if you don't find it adorable. Shallan ignored her, focusing instead on her drawing. Her lines grew surer as she worked, her mind slipping into that familiar, quiet place where the world faded away, and only the image remained. Until, inevitably, her thoughts drifted. She'd once been a different person, a girl who never would have found herself here, kneeling in the dirt beside a prince, laughing at the absurdities of life. A girl who would have stayed quiet, who would have kept her head down, who never would have dared to dream of being more. And yet, here she was. We've come so far, Radiant murmured. Shallan nodded absently, shading the curve of a vine. She had fought against herself for so long, torn between who she had been and who she was becoming. But maybe change wasn't something to be feared. Maybe, like these plants, she was simply adapting, reaching for the light after every storm. Adolin leaned over her shoulder, watching her sketch. You make it look so easy, he murmured. She smirked. That's because I don't let you see the 20 failed pages before this one. Renarin, crouching beside a moss-covered rock, spoke without looking up. But even the failed pages got you here. Shallan stilled for a moment, then smiled softly. You know, Renarin, I think I'm going to start quoting you in my notes, instead of Yasna. Renarin blinked. What? Adolin threw an arm around his brother's shoulders. You heard her, Renarin. You're officially as wise as Yasna. Don't let it go to your head. Renarin just looked utterly baffled. Shallan laughed, shaking her head as she returned to her drawing. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As Shallan continued sketching, the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the rocky terrain. The rock buds had fully opened now, their inner tendrils stretching outward like delicate fingers, seeking purchase in the damp morning air. She traced the lines with careful precision, her charcoal smudging slightly beneath her fingertips. Adolin and Renarin had shifted slightly away, their conversation drifting in and out of her awareness. Something about swordplay, shard plate, and a new training technique Dalinar had been advocating. Shallan let their words wash over her, comfortable in their presence, but content to lose herself in the quiet rhythm of her work. You're peaceful when you draw, Radiant observed. She's distracted, Vale countered. That's different. Shallan ignored them both. She turned the page, sketching the next detail. A small, skittering kremling darting between the rock formations. It had an iridescent shell, reflecting hints of blue and green, blending with the surrounding stone. It paused for a moment, antennae twitching, then scurried into a crevice. Shallan captured the moment quickly, her fingers working instinctively. Every time I think I've seen all the weird little creatures on this storm-blasted planet, Adolin mused, watching her work. Something new crawls out of a rock and proves me wrong. That's because you only look at things that can be hit with a sword, Shallan teased, glancing up at him. You'd be amazed at what you notice when you stop thinking about dueling everything you see. Adolin gasped in mock offense. Excuse me. I'll have you know I have never challenged a Kremling to a duel. Shallan arched an eyebrow. I notice you didn't say never thought about it. Adolin hesitated. Look, sometimes they look like they'd be good fighters. Renarin snorted. Shallan grinned, shaking her head as she added the last details to the sketch. The Kremling was gone now, vanished into whatever tiny world existed within the cracks of the stone. Shallan envied it a little. No expectations, no responsibilities, just instinct, just survival. You don't just want to survive, though, Radiant whispered. You want to matter. Shallan frowned slightly, gripping her charcoal tighter. She thought of Jasnah, of the weight of knowledge pressed into books, of truths carefully sorted and catalogued. She thought of her own journey, of the lies she'd told herself, the masks she'd worn, the truths she was still trying to uncover. Had she really come as far as she thought? Or was she still that girl, staring into the mirror, hoping to see someone else looking back? A hand touched her shoulder, grounding her. She blinked and looked up to find Adolin watching her with quiet concern. Hey, he said softly. Where did you go? Shallan forced a smile. Nowhere. Just thinking. Adolin didn't press. He never did. He just nodded, squeezing her shoulder before leaning back again. And Shallan, feeling the warmth of his presence beside her, took a deep breath and returned to her sketching. As the morning stretched on, the air warmed, and Shallan found herself shifting to the shade of a towering rock formation. Adolin and Renarin followed, their conversation now turning to mundane camp matters, supplies, rations, the upcoming march. Shallan let their voices fade into the background, focusing instead on a new subject. A cluster of vines winding around the base of the rock, their tiny leaves curled inward, waiting for moisture. She flipped to a fresh page and started sketching, her charcoal gliding over the parchment. The details came easily, perhaps too easily. She knew these motions, knew how to capture shape and shadow, but something about it felt mechanical today, like she was tracing an image rather than creating it. You're hesitating, Radiant noted. She's overthinking again, Vale said. Not everything has to mean something. But didn't it? Wasn't that what Jasnah had always said? Look deeper. Question what you see. Never take the world at face value? Shallan exhaled slowly and tried again, this time shifting her focus to the finer details. The delicate way the vines gripped the stone, the subtle texture of the leaves, the way light scattered across the surface. She lost herself in it, sketching, shading, refining, until a shadow fell over her work. She looked up to find Adolin peering down at the page, hands on his hips. Okay, he said. Now this one I can tell is good, but I have absolutely no idea why. Shallan smirked, tilting the sketchbook for him to see. It's the composition, she explained. Your eye follows the lines here, leading to this focal point. It creates a sense of movement. Adolin squinted at it. Right. Yes. Exactly what I was thinking. Renarin, sitting nearby, leaned over to glance at the page. It's perspective, he murmured. The way the vines wrap around the stone. It makes the rock feel alive. Shallan paused, considering. Alive. Yes, that was it. The vines weren't just on the rock. They were part of it, intertwined with it, adapting to it. She had been so focused on the shapes, the details, that she had almost missed the meaning behind them. Just like herself. Just like her own shifting identities. Her masks and truths tangled together, impossible to separate. "We are not one thing," Radiant whispered. "We are many, woven together." Shallan closed her sketchbook gently. Adolin nudged her shoulder. "You okay?" She looked at him, at his open expression, the way he never seemed to hide himself. And for once, she let herself answer honestly. "I think I am," she said. He grinned. "Good. Now, are we done watching plants grow, or do I need to start naming these vines too?" Shallan laughed, shaking her head. "Adolin, if you start naming plants, I'm leaving you for Yasna." Adolin gasped. "You wouldn't dare." Renarin adjusted his glasses. "She probably would." Adolin groaned. Shallan just laughed, standing and dusting herself off. For now, she would let the deeper thoughts rest. There would be time for them later. For now, she would just be here. As the day wore on, the camp began to gather its things in preparation for the next leg of the journey. The sun had reached its zenith, and Shallan felt the heat of the day settling heavily around her. She could already sense the weight of the march ahead, the long stretch of rocky terrain, and the looming uncertainty that always followed the high storms. Shallan folded her sketchbook carefully and tucked it into her bag. The images she'd captured today, like so many others, would wait for another time. She knew better than to push herself too hard when her thoughts were wandering. It was better to let the inspiration come naturally, rather than force it. As she turned toward the campfire, where the others were packing up, a thought drifted into her mind, one she couldn't quite shake. She thought of her father, his face hazy in her memories, the way his voice had always carried a weight of authority, the way his smile could turn cold without warning. It had been years since she had last seen him, since the day she had fled to Alethkar to escape his oppressive grasp. "You've never talked about him," Radiant murmured quietly in her mind. Shallan didn't respond at first. What happened to him? The question lingered, unwelcome yet persistent. She had never told anyone the truth. Not Yasna, not Adolin, not even herself. At least not fully. The fragments of her past were like pieces of a shattered mirror, sharp and painful, impossible to piece together without cutting herself on them. But maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from the things that had shaped her, from the family she had left behind. "He's still out there," Vale said softly. "But you don't have to go back to him." "No," Shallan said aloud, her voice steady despite the crackling of emotion in her chest. "I won't." Adolin turned toward her, his brows furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" Shallan smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Nothing. Just thinking." He didn't push further. Instead, he just nodded, giving her a small but understanding smile. "All right," he said, reaching out to gather his gear. "We'll have time to talk later if you want, but right now, we should get moving." Renarin stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "It's almost time to leave anyway. We'll make good time if we keep steady." Shallan nodded, pushing the memories away for now. There were more important things at hand. The camp had already begun to break down, soldiers preparing to march, and the thought of leaving this temporary haven behind stirred something in her. They were always moving, always traveling, always chasing the next destination. But it was strange, too. The longer she stayed with them, with Adolin and Renarin, the more it felt like home, like this strange little circle of people might be the closest thing she would ever have to a family. "What would he think of all this?" Radiant asked. her tone quiet but insistent. "Who?" Vale replied sharply. "Her father." Shallan shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I don't know. I suppose I'll never know. But that's all right. I've got enough people here with me to keep me going." Adolin gave her a playful shove. "You'd better. I'm not sure you'd survive without us." Shallan smirked. "Oh, I'd survive. Just not as well." And with that, she turned her back on the question that still lingered in her thoughts, focusing on the task ahead. The road was long, the journey uncertain, but with each step she took, she knew she was one step closer to finding out who she truly was, and who she could become. The march that day was long, the landscape unforgiving as the rocky terrain stretched endlessly before them. The sun beat down, the heat and dust settling into every crevice, making it difficult to keep track of the time. Shallan's feet ached in her boots, and the weight of her bag seemed heavier with each step. Still, she pressed on, though her thoughts continued to wander like the endless road beneath her. Adolin had taken the lead, as he often did, his stride confident and steady, his shard plate gleaming in the sun. Renarin was a little further back, his quiet nature ever present, though he did occasionally engage in light conversation with Shallan, keeping the mood light. Shallan's mind kept returning to her sketches from earlier that day. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was missing, as if there was some element she hadn't captured, an angle, a pattern, a deeper connection she hadn't yet understood. "You're still thinking about the sketches, aren't you?" Radiant asked, her voice soft but knowing. Shallan smiled to herself. "I can't help it. It's what I do." But even as she walked, her thoughts continued to circle. There was something about Roshar, about the people and the land, that both fascinated and unsettled her. It was as if every inch of this place was alive with some greater purpose, some deeper meaning that she couldn't yet decipher. It wasn't just the plants or the creatures. It was the way everything interacted, the patterns that were hidden in plain sight. "You see it, don't you?" Radiance said, sensing her shift in focus. "The connections, the way the world works beneath the surface." Shallan's steps faltered for a moment. "I do. It's like a puzzle, but the pieces are scattered everywhere, and I can't quite fit them together." Vale interrupted, her voice sharp. "Quit overthinking it. If you don't stop staring at the landscape like it's a riddle, we're going to be the last ones to camp." Adolin glanced over his shoulder with a raised eyebrow. "Is everything all right back there?" Shallan blinked, realizing she'd slowed her pace without even realizing it. She quickly caught up with him, shaking her head. "Just thinking about, well, nothing important." Adolin gave her a knowing look but didn't press. Instead, he returned his focus to the road ahead, the sound of his boots crunching on the rocky surface in time with their steps. Renarin, ever observant, glanced at Shallan with quiet curiosity. "What do you see, Shallan?" She paused, taken aback by his question. "What do you mean?" Renarin's eyes were thoughtful as he adjusted his glasses. "When you look at things, whether it's a plant or the landscape or the people around you, you always seem to notice things that others don't. You see connections. It's like you're reading a map that isn't there." Shallan's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she wondered if he could see more than he let on. "I don't know. I guess I just look a little deeper than most people." "Is that the truth?" Radiant's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Or are you just hiding behind a mask again?" Shallan flinched, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. The question echoed in her mind, but she pushed it away. She didn't want to think about it. Not now. Adolin, oblivious to the internal struggle she was wrestling with, clapped Renarin on the shoulder. Maybe Shallan's just more observant than the rest of us. He grinned, his voice light. She certainly knows how to keep us on our toes. Shallan forced a laugh, the tension easing slightly. She looked at Renarin, who gave her a small, understanding smile. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt something unspoken pass between them. A quiet bond, like the shared weight of unacknowledged truths. "You're not alone, Shallan," Radiant whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the march. "We're here." For a moment, Shallan felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of her thoughts. She couldn't afford to dwell on things she couldn't change, not right now. Ahead of them, the distant outline of their next destination began to take shape. Another camp, another night under the stars. They would rest there, gather their strength, and continue their journey in the morning. Shallan quickened her pace, pushing the lingering doubts aside. She wasn't ready to face them just yet. The camp that night was quieter than usual. The soft murmur of soldiers settling into their sleeping roles, mixing with the distant hum of the winds that would surely come with the high storm. The sun had set, the sky darkening into a tapestry of stars, and the air had cooled, the harsh heat of the day receding into memory. Shallan sat by the edge of the camp, her sketchbook in her lap, the charcoal still in her hand. She hadn't felt like drawing all day, but the pull to create, to capture something beautiful in the chaos, was too strong to ignore. Her mind had calmed during the march, though there were still traces of that lingering feeling, of the puzzle that wouldn't quite fit together. She had long since stopped trying to make sense of it. Maybe she would never understand. Adolin and Renarin were engaged in quiet conversation near the fire, their voices low and easy, their presence a comforting backdrop to her own thoughts. She looked at them. The way their rapport seemed so natural, so effortless. They were family, in their own way, and that thought made her feel lighter, even as something else tugged at her heart. "We're just passing through," Vale said, her tone detached. "Nothing lasts. You can't let yourself get too attached." Shallan grimaced at the reminder. It was hard to shake that voice, so familiar, so insistent. But then there was Radiant, a quiet counterbalance, a voice that always seemed to speak in whispers, always gentler. "It's okay to be attached. You don't have to be alone." She wasn't sure which voice to listen to anymore, but for now, she let both fade into the background as she focused on the stars overhead. The vastness of the sky above her felt like a balm for her restless thoughts, its silence offering a kind of peace that was impossible to find anywhere else. "Adolin should be here," Radiance said after a long silence. "He could help." Shallan shook her head slightly. "He's a good man, but he doesn't need to carry my burdens." Vale's voice cut through the quiet, with a touch of disdain. "You're doing fine on your own, aren't you? Just remember, no one's here to solve your problems for you." But even as the words hung in the air, Shallan found herself remembering the moments with Adolin, his kindness, his easy confidence, and the way he made her feel like she wasn't broken. He didn't try to fix her, didn't try to erase her past. He just was, and that was enough. She didn't know why that thought brought a sense of comfort. A soft rustling beside her broke her thoughts. She looked up to find Renarin sitting next to her, a quiet presence in the otherwise bustling camp. "Can I join you?" he asked, his voice unassuming. Shallan smiled softly, nodding. Of course. For a while, they sat together in silence, the crackling of the campfire casting flickering shadows on the ground. Renarin's presence was gentle, unobtrusive, and somehow comforting. "You've been drawing a lot," Renarin said after a moment, his tone thoughtful. Shallan glanced at her sketchbook, where several incomplete drawings lay. "I suppose I have. I get lost in it sometimes." Renarin nodded, adjusting his glasses. "It's good to get lost. Sometimes it helps us find ourselves." Shallan blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the words. She hadn't expected that kind of insight from Renarin. "You're a lot deeper than people give you credit for. You know that?" Renarin gave a small, almost shy smile. "I've learned a lot from watching others." "Like Adolin?" Shallan asked, grinning. Renarin laughed quietly. "Yes, he's been an interesting study." Shallan chuckled. "I imagine so. I don't think I've ever met someone as comfortable in their own skin as he is." "That's the thing," Renarin said quietly, his voice almost thoughtful. "It's not just about being comfortable. It's about knowing who you are, even when things don't go as planned." Shallan's smile faded slightly, her gaze dropping to the fire. She didn't know how to respond to that. She was still searching, still figuring it out. She wasn't sure she would ever feel completely comfortable with who she was. "I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for," Renarin said, as if reading her thoughts. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." The quiet reassurance was enough to ease some of the weight from her shoulders. She didn't say anything in response, but she felt a small sense of peace settle over her, like a soft blanket in the cold night. The rest of the camp was winding down, the soldiers preparing for sleep, and the distant rumble of the coming high storm could already be heard. Shallan stood slowly, stretching her legs. She could feel the storm building, the tension in the air, the inevitable chaos just around the corner. But for now, there was quiet. There was calm. And for once, she allowed herself to feel it, to let the moment linger. The high storm came just as the camp was finishing its final preparations for the night. The sky darkened quickly, the wind howling louder as it whipped across the open plains, and the first drops of rain began to fall, stinging like tiny needles against exposed skin. Shallan, who had been sitting by the fire, stood quickly, adjusting her cloak to shield herself from the rain. The camp scrambled into action, securing their shelters, gathering supplies, and preparing for the worst. The wind roared around them, but the familiarity of the storm brought an odd sense of comfort. She glanced over at Adolin, his figure silhouetted against the storm, as he helped Renarin adjust the protective barriers around their tents. There was something oddly reassuring about watching him move with such confidence, as if he was at home in the chaos, like the storm was just another part of the world he knew. "It's easy for him, isn't it?" Vale said, her voice tinged with a bitter edge. "He just takes everything in stride, like it's nothing. No wonder you're always so fascinated by him." Shallan bit back the urge to respond sharply. Yes, Adolin was comfortable in his own skin. Yes, he seemed unaffected by the chaos that raged around them, but that didn't make him any less real, any less human. Instead, she turned away, focusing on her own task, securing her sketchbook and ensuring her supplies wouldn't be damaged by the storm. She had learned long ago that there was no sense in fighting the winds, no sense in trying to keep everything in perfect order. High storms were a part of life here, part of Roshar, and they had to be weathered just as they were. "You're thinking too much," Radiant remarked, her voice light. "Just live in the moment for once." Shallan huffed out a breath, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I'm trying." As the storm intensified, the sound of its fury consumed everything. The wind, the rain, the pounding of her heart in her chest. She found herself retreating to the tent they had set up, her thoughts drifting to Yasna's lessons again. Yasna had always been so certain, so focused on her purpose. She'd never let the storms rattle her, never let them stop her from moving forward. There was something to be said for that kind of resolve, but Shallan wasn't sure if she could ever reach that level of control. She wasn't built like Yasna. "And maybe you don't need to be," Radiant interjected. "Maybe the world needs someone like you." Shallan hesitated, the thought taking root in her mind, but before she could dwell on it, Adolin's voice cut through the noise of the storm. "Shallan, are you all right?" His tone was concerned, his figure visible through the flaps of the tent as he ducked inside. Shallan looked up, startled by the sound of her name. "Oh, yes, I'm fine. Just getting out of the wind." Adolin nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "All right. Well, if you need anything, you know where I am." He gave her a reassuring smile before turning back toward the storm outside. As the flap closed behind him, Shallan let out a quiet breath. She wasn't used to people being so open, so willing to check on her, to care. And yet, there was a part of her that resisted, a part of her that kept pushing him away. "Don't push him away," Radiant said, her voice gentle. "Not when you need him the most." Shallan closed her eyes for a moment, the roar of the high storm outside still deafening. Her mind, though, was quiet for the first time in a long while. For now, the storm was not something to fight. It was something to endure. And for now, she would let herself just be. The storm raged through the night, its fury unabated as the hours stretched on. The constant thrumming of the rain and the howling wind filled the air, creating an unrelenting cacophony that seemed to invade every corner of Shallan's mind. She lay awake in her tent, staring at the shadows that danced on the walls, the rhythmic sound of the storm both comforting and unsettling at once. Though the winds outside were harsh, and the storm's intensity never seemed to ease, within the confines of the tent, it was surprisingly quiet. Her companions had all fallen into a deep sleep, their breathing steady, the only sign of their presence the soft rise and fall of their chests. Even Adolin, who often seemed so awake to the world around him, was fast asleep, his features softened in the moonlight that filtered in through the cracks in the canvas. But Shallan couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were too loud, too demanding. She reached for her sketchbook, the comforting weight of it in her hands grounding her as her fingers flipped through the pages. The sketches from earlier in the day were scattered across the pages, some incomplete, others almost perfect. The plants she had drawn, the strange creatures she had observed, they all seemed to call to her, pulling her deeper into the mystery of the world around her. "What's missing?" Radiant's voice was quiet, but insistent. "You know something is missing. What is it?" Shallan frowned, her eyes lingering on the drawings. She could feel the puzzle pieces clicking together, but there was always one fragment just out of reach, something elusive, just beyond her grasp. We don't always have to find the answers, Vale's voice chimed in sharply. You're better off leaving some things unfinished. Shallan bit her lip, glancing at Adolin's sleeping form once more. It was easy for him to focus on the present, to let things unfold as they would. It was easy for him to leave things behind. But she couldn't do that. Not yet. She returned her gaze to her sketchbook, her hand already reaching for her charcoal. She had to find it. She had to understand. As she began to sketch again, the wind outside the tent picked up, rattling the flaps and sending a shiver through the air. The storm was still going strong, the pressure building as the hours ticked by. There was something about the storm that felt like it mirrored her own turmoil, wild, uncontrollable, pushing against the barriers she had so carefully erected around herself. But still, she sketched. Her mind wandered between the lines of her drawings, back and forth between the creatures she had seen earlier, and the lessons Yasna had imparted. Always observe, Shallan. Every detail is important. Yasna's voice echoed in her mind, though it felt distant, almost like a dream. Was that all it was? Was it just about observing? Or was there something more? Sometimes, it's not about what you see, but how you see it, Radiant said, her voice soft but certain. You're looking too hard. Shallan paused, her hand hovering over the page. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that she had been trying to force the answers into existence, trying to make sense of it all through sheer willpower. But maybe that wasn't the way. Maybe she just needed to let the answers come to her. She set the charcoal down, taking a deep breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the storm, letting the sound wash over her. And then, nothing. The world around her fell silent. No voices, no pressure, no urgent need to find something that wasn't ready to be found. For a long time, Shallan simply sat in the dark, letting the storm rage outside while she held her place in the stillness. In this moment, she wasn't the scholar, the artist, or the daughter of a broken house. She was just herself. The quiet was almost unbearable, but at the same time, it was a reprieve. For once, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything, to be anything more than what she was right then. You're allowed to rest, Radiant whispered, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. You don't always have to be doing something. Shallan let herself sink deeper into that peace, letting the storm outside become a distant memory as she breathed in the moment. And then, after what felt like hours, there was a soft knock on the tent. She blinked, startled, before quickly sitting up. The storm's fury had begun to subside, the wind dying down, but the rain still tapped against the canvas. The flap opened, and Adolin's figure appeared in the doorway. Shallan, are you awake? His voice was soft, careful, as though he didn't want to disturb the quiet she had found. She looked at him for a moment, unsure of what to say. Her mind felt clear, like she had been granted some small moment of respite. Yes, I'm awake, she replied, her voice a little hoarse from the silence. Adolin stepped in, his eyes scanning her, assessing her state. I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check in on you. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The storm, the struggle, the uncertainty, it all seemed far away as she met his gaze. I'm all right, Shallan said, offering him a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Adolin nodded, his expression softening. All right. Just wanted to make sure you were okay. He lingered for a moment longer before giving her a reassuring smile and stepping back into the rain-soaked night. as the flap closed behind him. Shallan exhaled slowly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe it wasn't the storm outside that she needed to survive after all. Maybe it was the quiet moments in between. The night passed quietly, the storm outside slowly fading as dawn approached. The faintest light began to creep through the cracks of the tent, signaling the end of the high storm. The air, once thick with the weight of the storm's intensity, had cleared, leaving behind a fresh, earthy scent that lingered in the still morning. Shallan stretched, the familiar stiffness of sleeping on the ground, pulling her from her dreams. The weight of the sketchbook beside her was comforting. The pages inside now filled with an assortment of sketches. Some of the strange flora she had encountered, some of the animals, and even a few of her own expressions, the pencil lines soft and uncertain. She knew that this was part of her process. She had to see the world around her, the details, the beauty, and the strange truths that lived in the small things. But she also knew that there was more beneath the surface. The world of Roshar was vast, and its mysteries weren't always easily solved. "You're still overthinking it," Vale remarked, the voice sharp and practical. "You've been staring at those pages for hours. It's time to move on." But Shallan could not stop herself. There was something about these sketches, something that just didn't quite sit right with her. She could feel it, the subtle thread that tied all of her drawings together, but it was too elusive to capture. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair, realizing how long it had been since she had truly rested. The high storm had rattled her more than she'd expected, stirring up old memories and new fears. "You need to focus, Shallan," Radiant said quietly, the voice soft but filled with a quiet certainty. "There's a bigger picture here. You just have to let it come to you." The words echoed in her mind as she glanced around the tent, noticing how much had changed since she'd first set out on this journey. She wasn't the same person who had fled her home all those months ago. She had found new family, new strength, and new purpose along the way. But there was still so much more to uncover, so much more to understand. As she reached for her sketchbook again, she heard the soft sound of footsteps outside the tent. A moment later, the flap opened, and Adolin's figure appeared in the doorway, framed by the soft light of morning. He looked different in the daylight, still handsome, of course, but more relaxed, less intense than he had been in the chaos of the storm. "Morning," he said with a small, easy smile. "Morning," Shallan replied, her own smile a little more hesitant than she wanted it to be. She still wasn't sure how to navigate the space between them, the unspoken tension that hung in the air. "I brought you breakfast," Adolin continued, holding up a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Thought you might need something before we get moving again." Shallan looked at the food, her stomach reminding her that it had been too long since she'd eaten. She accepted the offering with a grateful smile. "Thank you. I didn't realize how hungry I was." He settled down next to her, his movements smooth and easy, as though he belonged there. "I figured. You've been working hard lately." She hesitated before glancing at him, her fingers brushing lightly against the pages of her sketchbook. I've been thinking a lot about the things Yasna taught me." Adolin nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. You've got a lot on your plate." "Not just that," Shallan said softly, lowering her gaze. "It's everything. The things I'm not seeing. I've been looking at these drawings for hours, and I feel like I'm on the edge of something, but I can't quite reach it." Adolin tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes you can't find the answer right away. Sometimes you just have to wait." She gave a small, rueful laugh. "You sound like Renarin." Adolin grinned. "Well, he's right, isn't he?" Shallan's smile softened, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm not sure I can wait anymore." Adolin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply sat there beside her, his presence quiet and grounding. The simple act of him being there was more comforting than Shallan had realized. After a long pause, he reached over and gently placed a hand on hers, a reassuring touch that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't have to do it all at once, Shallan. You've already done so much. You're stronger than you think." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. He didn't have to say those words, didn't have to offer her this kind of reassurance. But somehow, it felt like the weight she had been carrying for so long was a little lighter now. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it. The tension she had been holding in her chest eased just a little. Adolin let his hand fall back to his side, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The world outside was waking up, the sounds of the morning gradually filling the air. The day had begun, and it was time to face whatever came next. Shallan took a deep breath and stood, her hand still resting on the sketchbook. "Thank you, Adolin, for everything." He flashed her a grin. "Any time." As they both began to prepare for the day ahead, Shallan couldn't shake the feeling that she was at the edge of something new. The path ahead was still unclear, but she felt as though she might finally be ready to step forward into it. And this time, she wouldn't have to do it alone. The day unfolded quietly, the camp gradually coming to life as the last traces of the high storm faded away. The air was thick with humidity, but the light that filtered through the clouds brought a sense of clarity, as though the world itself was taking a deep breath after the storm's fury. Shallan couldn't shake the feeling of unease, though. Despite Adolin's reassuring words, despite the calm that had settled over the camp, she still couldn't shake the sense that something was just beyond her reach. She walked through the camp, her eyes darting between the tents, the few scattered remains of the storm's destruction, and the other members of the group. Each person seemed to have their own way of handling the aftermath. Some were busy preparing for the journey ahead, others were tending to horses, and a few were simply sitting in quiet reflection. But it was the stillness that unsettled her. "Are you always this on edge?" Vale's voice, cool and biting, cut through Shallan's thoughts. "We've survived storms before. Just breathe. It'll pass." But Shallan didn't want it to pass. She needed something to change, needed the world to reveal its secrets to her. The sketches, the observations, there was something there, something she wasn't seeing, and it gnawed at her like a puzzle with a piece that refused to fit. "You don't need to solve everything at once." Radiant's voice was gentle, but firm. "You'll find it in time. Trust yourself." The words were calming, even if they didn't quiet her racing thoughts. Shallan pressed her fingertips to her temples, willing herself to focus. Adolin's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Shallan, you've got that look again." She glanced up, startled to see him standing a few paces away, holding the reins of his horse. He had that familiar, teasing grin on his face, though there was an undercurrent of concern beneath it. "That look?" she asked, confused. "You know, the I'm thinking too much look." He stepped closer, raising an eyebrow. You're not planning to sketch in the middle of the plains again, are you?" Shallan flushed, quickly tucking her sketchbook under her arm. She had gotten into the habit of finding quiet corners of the camp to lose herself in her drawings. But this time felt different. This time, the act of drawing felt more like an escape than a creative outlet. "I wasn't planning on it," she replied quickly, though her fingers itched for her charcoal. Adolin seemed to accept her answer, though he was clearly still studying her. "I know you're trying to figure something out, but I'm here if you need to talk, Shallan. You don't always have to keep things to yourself." Shallan hesitated, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk. It was more that she wasn't sure how to explain the turmoil in her mind, the flood of thoughts that refused to settle. How could she tell him that she was feeling both lost and found at the same time? "Maybe you should talk to him," Vale suggested, her tone uncharacteristically softer than usual. "He wants to help. Let him." Shallan swallowed, her heart beating faster than it had a moment ago. She had never been particularly good at talking about her feelings, especially with someone who cared for her. She started, but then stopped herself. "I don't even know where to begin." Adolin smiled warmly, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. "You don't have to have all the answers, Shallan. You don't have to explain everything at once. Just take it one step at a time." The simplicity of his words made something in her chest tighten. He made it sound so easy, so straightforward, but it wasn't. "I'll try," she said softly, finally meeting his gaze. The connection between them, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to acknowledge until now, seemed to deepen in that moment. Adolin gave a small nod, his smile lingering. "That's all I ask." He turned back toward his horse, and Shallan watched him for a moment, the weight of his words settling into her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open up completely, but there was a part of her, just a small part, that wanted to. For now, though, she would focus on the journey ahead. She would take things one step at a time. As the group gathered their things and prepared to leave, Shallan joined them, her sketchbook still tucked under her arm. The landscape around them seemed to stretch on forever, a vast, untamed expanse that both called to her and intimidated her in equal measure. But she wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough for today. The journey continued, the days blending into each other as Shallan moved forward with the group, her mind preoccupied with the sketches and notes she had filled her journal with. The beauty of Roshar, the bizarre and captivating flora and fauna, was impossible to ignore. It was so much to take in. Too much, perhaps. The more she saw, the more questions arose, and the more the pressure built to find answers that might not even exist yet. Her thoughts wandered constantly, drifting between the present and the past, between the quiet moments of companionship and the loud, echoing silence in her mind. Adolin, as usual, was a steady presence by her side, always offering support, though he hadn't pushed her to talk more about what was troubling her. But today, the day felt different. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the vast plains. The air had a slight chill to it, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of Roshar's weather. Shallan had spent the morning sketching a strange, luminous flower she had found near a rocky outcrop, its petals glowing faintly in the dim light. The flower reminded her of something she couldn't quite place, a fleeting memory, a moment from her past, perhaps. As she finished her sketch, She stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees, and glanced over at Adolin, who was conversing with Renarin about the latest progress on their route. There was a quiet ease between them, the natural rhythm of their friendship and shared understanding. For a moment, Shallan felt the faintest pang of envy. How easy it seemed for them, how at peace they were with the journey. She had spent so much of her life running from herself, running from the truth. But now, here on the edge of this strange world, she couldn't escape the questions that haunted her. "Why are you still here, Shallan?" Vale's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and dismissive. "You're wasting time. We should be moving forward, not stuck in this place of indecision." Shallan clenched her jaw, trying to ignore the bite of Vale's words. It wasn't easy, of course, but Vale was always like this, urging her to be stronger, faster, more decisive, to push through the discomfort, to bury the doubts. "Vale, stop." Radiant's voice was firm, protective. "She doesn't need you to be harsh right now. We've been through enough. She just needs a moment of peace." Shallan let out a slow breath, feeling a rare moment of calm wash over her. Radiant's words were always gentler, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone in this struggle. But it was still hard to shake the weight of Vale's presence, the need for action, the demand to keep moving even when she wasn't sure where she was going. Her attention shifted back to Adolin. He had noticed her standing off to the side, watching him, and he gave her a smile, a silent invitation to join the conversation. She hesitated, but then walked over to him, her steps purposeful but measured. "You're thinking too much again," Adolin teased lightly, his tone gentle but knowing. Shallan smiled, though it felt tight, like the muscles in her face didn't want to cooperate. "I suppose I am. There's just so much to see here, so many things I don't understand." "You've got time," Adolin replied, his voice warm with reassurance. "And you've got the rest of us with you. No need to rush things." It was a simple statement, but it settled in her chest in a way that made her pause. For the first time in a long while, Shallan let herself breathe, really breathe, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of her burden seemed just a little lighter. "Thanks, Adolin," she said quietly, her smile softening. He gave her a small nod, his expression more serious now. "Anytime, Shallan. I mean it." The conversation shifted back to their travel plans, but Shallan's thoughts wandered again. This time, not so much in a rush to find answers, but in a gentle curiosity. It was like standing at the edge of something vast, the world unfolding before her, and realizing that perhaps she didn't need to understand everything all at once. She could take her time. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the group continued forward, the rhythmic sound of hooves on the rocky ground providing a strange sort of comfort. As they walked, Shallan allowed her mind to drift again, this time to the lessons Jasnah had imparted upon her. The words of her mentor were sharp, wise, and often cryptic, but Shallan had come to understand that they held layers of meaning. There is always more to see, Shallan. The world is complex, but you must learn to look beyond the surface. Only then can you truly begin to understand. The memory of Jasnah's teachings brought a spark of inspiration, and Shallan's fingers twitched for her sketchbook. She could see it now, the way the world was shifting in her mind, the connections slowly coming together. It wasn't about forcing herself to find the answers. It was about letting them come to her, letting the pieces fall into place when they were ready. That's the way, isn't it? Radiant mused, her voice soft. You don't need to chase after everything. Sometimes, you just have to wait for the right moment. Shallan smiled to herself, the feeling of understanding settling over her like a blanket. She had time. She had the journey ahead, and the answers would come when they were ready. For now, she would follow the path before her, sketching the world around her as she had done before. The creatures, the plants, the sky above. It was enough. It had to be enough. The days continued to blur together, the steady rhythm of travel grounding Shallan in a way she hadn't expected. The road ahead was uncertain, yes, but there was comfort in the familiar, the steady thud of hooves beneath her, the crackling of campfires, the chatter of the others. Despite the chaos and uncertainty that lurked in the corners of her mind, the world around her felt tangible, real, and filled with possibilities. Still, there were moments when her thoughts would drift, the weight of her inner conflict returning in waves. She'd be sketching a strange, spiny plant, or cataloging the erratic behavior of a small creature, only to be pulled back into herself. There was always that whisper in the back of her mind, urging her to keep pushing, to find the answers. But those moments, those brief flashes of clarity, were becoming fewer and farther between. You're running from it again, Vale's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and accusatory. You can't keep avoiding what's right in front of you, Shallan. Shallan winced, but didn't respond. Vale was always the one to drive her forward, the one who demanded action, demanded answers. But today was different. Today, Shallan had reached a new place, a place of acceptance. I'm not running, she replied softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. I'm just waiting for the right moment. Waiting, Vale scoffed. How convenient. It was Radiant's voice that came next, quiet and calm. It's okay, Shallan. Sometimes the right moment comes when you least expect it. It's not about forcing it. Shallan closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the cool evening air. The others were setting up camp, preparing for the night. Adolin was nearby, laughing with Kaladin, his voice carrying over the quiet sounds of the night. It was a moment of peace, a moment that Shallan found herself clinging to, but peace was a fleeting thing. Are you all right? The question came from behind her, soft and gentle. Shallan turned to find Adolin standing a few steps away, his expression thoughtful, but filled with concern. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm fine. Just thinking. Adolin tilted his head slightly, studying her with a quiet understanding. About what? Shallan hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze, but also the comfort that came from his presence. She didn't have to explain everything to him. Not yet, at least. But somehow, she found herself speaking anyway. It's strange, isn't it? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to be so certain of everything, of my choices, of my purpose. But now, I feel like I'm just drifting. Adolin stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You're not drifting, Shallan. You're finding your way. It's not always clear, but it's there. You've made it this far. She swallowed hard, the emotion welling up inside her. There was so much she wanted to say, so much The fire flickered in the center of the camp, its warm glow casting shadows that danced across the faces of those gathered around it. Shallan sat with the others, her mind still quiet, but more at ease than it had been in days. The conversation was light, casual even, as they shared stories and teased each other. But beneath it all, There was a sense of camaraderie that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. For a brief moment, Shallan let herself lean back, staring up at the stars that dotted the night sky. The constellations were unfamiliar, their patterns strange and new. But in that unfamiliarity, there was something comforting. She had always been drawn to the mysteries of the world, to the things that were hidden just beyond her reach. And in this vast, unpredictable land, those mysteries seemed endless. So, what's next for you, Shallan? Adolin's voice broke through her reverie, soft but curious. Shallan turned toward him, blinking as though waking from a dream. What do you mean? I mean, what do you want to do next? You've been so focused lately, and I was wondering if you've thought about what comes after all of this. The question caught her off guard. She hadn't really thought about the future, not in any concrete way. Her mind had been so occupied with the present, with the journey ahead, and the mysteries she was unraveling, that she hadn't stopped to consider what came after. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to put her thoughts into words. I guess I haven't really thought about it. I've been so caught up in everything that's been happening, I haven't stopped to think about what happens once we reach our goal. Adolin gave her a thoughtful look, his expression more serious now. You don't have to have all the answers, Shallan, but it's okay to think about them. It's okay to have dreams, even when the world around you is unpredictable. She looked down at her hands, tracing the edges of her sketchbook absent-mindedly. She hadn't realized how much she had been suppressing, how much she had been holding back. Dreams, hopes, fears. They had all been buried beneath the weight of her past and the uncertainty of her present. Dreams, Vale said, her tone laced with a mixture of bitterness and yearning. What's the point of dreaming when the world keeps pushing you down? Shallan shook her head, trying to push Vale's voice to the back of her mind. It was hard not to let her words take root, but she had learned enough over the years to recognize when her darker self was clouding her thoughts. You can still dream, even when things seem impossible. Radiant's voice was quiet but firm, her reminder a steady anchor in Shallan's turbulent thoughts. It's okay to want something more, even if you don't know what that looks like yet. Shallan closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, she let herself entertain the thought of what might come next. What if, just for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the chaos? A life that wasn't defined by the trauma of her past or the pressure of her responsibilities. What would that look like? She whispered to herself, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. Adolin watched her carefully, his gaze soft but filled with understanding. Whatever it is, Shallan, you'll figure it out. You've always been able to adapt, to grow, even when the path seemed unclear. You don't have to have it all mapped out. She met his gaze, the warmth of his words sinking into her chest. The idea of a future, of dreams that weren't tied to the weight of her past, was both exhilarating and terrifying. But for the first time in a long while, Shallan wasn't afraid to imagine it. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know exactly where the road would lead. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could start by finding the courage to walk it, step by step, sketch by sketch, and with the support of those who cared about her. The fire crackled softly in the background, the flames casting flickering light on the faces of her friends. in the quiet of the night, Shallan allowed herself a small, tentative smile. "Maybe I'll start by finishing this drawing," she said, holding up her sketchbook as if to reassure herself as much as anyone else. Adolin smiled back, his eyes lighting up with that same warmth. "I think that sounds like a good start." And with that, Shallan allowed herself to breathe a little easier, the weight of her inner turmoil slowly lifting, replaced by the quiet promise of what was to come. For the first time in a long while, Shallan felt ready to face the future, whatever it might bring.